The entire compound fell silent. Not the quiet of sleep, the quiet of dread. Emeka stood at the edge of his father's grave, a folded letter pressed tight against his chest, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely hold it. The village elders stood behind him in a half-circle, watching. The women had stopped pounding. The children had been pulled indoors. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. His father had buried this letter with his own hands 3 days before he died. He had called Emeka close, gripped his wrist with the last of his strength, and said 7 words that Emeka could not unhear. Do not dig it up. Let it sleep. And for 6 months, 6 long, hungry, confusing months, Emeka had obeyed. He had watched his uncle take the compound. He had watched his mother move to the outer hut like a stranger in her own home. He had watched his younger siblings eat 1 meal a day and call it enough. He had buried his grief beneath his father's warning and told himself, a promise made to the dead is the most sacred kind. But tonight something had changed. Tonight, the ground above that grave had cracked open on its own. No rain had fallen. No animal had burrowed. The earth above his father's resting place had simply split, a clean, straight line, like a mouth about to speak. And from that crack, a smell rose that Emeka had only known once before, the night his father sat him down as a boy and burned a rare bark at midnight, and said, "This is the scent of a door between worlds. When you smell it, something is trying to reach you." Emeka had smelled it then as a child and forgotten it. He smelled it now and remembered everything. So he stood there with a lantern in one hand and his father's final warning echoing in his chest, and he had a choice no living son should ever have to make. Obey the dead. Or answer the ground. What he found inside that letter did not just change his life. It changed the name of every person standing behind him. And it almost destroyed the one thing his father had spent 40 years trying to protect. This woman is talking and making her have hand gestures. The village of Ugwuta sat between 2 hills like something the land had swallowed and never fully let go. It was not the kind of place that appeared on any map drawn by men who had never walked barefoot on red earth. But every person born within its borders knew exactly where it was, because Ugwuta had a feeling to it. A weight. The kind that settled on your shoulders the moment you entered and only lifted when you left. It was a place of old rules and older memories. The compounds were built close together, not for warmth, but for watching. Neighbors here did not miss a thing. They counted how many times your cock crowed. They noticed when your firewood ran low. They knew, before you knew yourself, when trouble was moving toward your door. And trouble had been moving toward Emeka's door for a long time. His father, Ichinaji, had been the most respected man in Ugwuta, not because of wealth, though he had some. Not because of the title, though he had earned one. But because of something rarer. He was a man people brought their impossible problems to, and somehow, he always found the door hidden inside the wall. When Ichinaji died, Ogita did not just lose a man. It lost its compass. And Emeka, 24 years old, the firstborn son, a young man who 3 days before Ichinaji died, he sent everyone away. Not gently. Not with the soft voice of a man making peace with the end. He sent them away the way a general clears a room before speaking about war, with a look that made even the oldest elder rise without argument and find somewhere else to be. Only Emeka remained. His father waited until the last footstep faded. Until the compound settles into the particular silence that only exists when you are certain no one is listening. Then he reached beneath his sleeping mat and pulled out something Emeka had never seen before, a letter, folded 3 times, sealed with candle wax pressed with his father's thumb, and wrapped in the dried leaf of an *Ujalisai* tree. The Ujalisai. The tree of the ancestors. The one you only cut when the matter concerns the dead and the unborn at the same time. Emeka's mouth went dry. His father placed the letter in his hands. Let him feel the weight of it. Then he took it back. I am going to bury this, Ichinaji said. Beneath my head. So that it travels with me and stays with the earth at the same time. Emeka said nothing. His father's eyes were not the eyes of a sick man. They were sharp and still, the way deep water is still. There is a time for this letter to be opened, his father continued. And there is a time that is too soon. If it is opened too soon, what is written inside will be used as a weapon by people who have already sharpened themselves against this family. You will not be able to protect what must be protected. You will lose before the fight begins. He held Emeka's gaze without blinking. So you will not dig it up. Not when you are grieving. Not when you are angry. Not when your uncle arrives with his smooth words and his borrowed elders. Not when your mother cries. Not even when you cry. Emeka swallowed. Then when? His father looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he built with his hands and is about to trust on the road. "The ground will tell you," he said. "When the time is right, the earth above that grave will open. Not from rain. Not from animals. It will open because I will ask it to. And when it does, only then do you dig." He pressed his thumb against his son's chest. "Before that moment, if anyone touches that ground, including you, what is buried will not save this family." He paused. "It will bury it." Emeka nodded. He had made the promise. He had kept it for 6 months. Until the night the earth cracked open on its own, and everything his father had warned him about was already standing inside the compound, waiting. The first person to move against Emeka was not his uncle. It was Ada, his father's oldest friend's wife. A woman who had eaten in their compound more times than she had eaten on her own. She came 3 weeks after the burial with a pot of soup and a mouthful of concern. "Emeka Noir M," she said, sitting across from him with her hands folded like a woman in prayer. "People are talking. They say you have been seen at the grave at night. Standing there. Doing nothing." She lowered her voice. "They are saying your father left something behind, and that you are hiding it from the family." She was not asking. She was informing him of the shape the story had already taken without his input. "There is nothing hidden," Emeka said. Ada looked at him the way you look at a child who has just lied badly. She picked up her pot and left. By evening, 4 compounds had heard a version of the conversation that Emeka did not recognize. Then came his uncle. Chukwuemeka arrived not with confrontation but with warmth, the most dangerous weapon a calculating man owns. He called Emeka *na m. He praised his father's memory loudly in front of witnesses. He brought palm wine and shared it with the elders in the compound like a man already hosting. Then, one evening, he sat beside Emeka and spoke quietly. "Your father was a great man," he said. "But great men sometimes carry burdens that are too heavy for one person. Whatever he left behind, it belongs to this family, not to you alone." He smiled. "You are young. You do not have to carry this by yourself. Let the elders help you. Let me help you." The offer sounded like kindness. It was a hand reaching for the letter. When Emeka still did not move, the pressure changed shape. His closest friend, Tabena, came to him one night, genuinely afraid. "Emeka, I am telling you as a brother. Your uncle has already visited the land registry office in town. I do not know what documents he is holding. But if there is anything in that grave that can speak for your father's wishes, you need to bring it out now before he makes the first move official." Greed had sharpened itself into urgency. And then came the elders. 3 of them. Seated in the compound like a formal gathering had been called without Emeka's knowledge. The oldest spoke without greeting. "The dead do not own property," he said. "The living must settle what the dead left unsettled. If your father buried something that concerns this family's land and inheritance, tradition demands it be brought forward for arbitration." He looked at Emeka the way authority always looks at the young, like patience is simply another word for pressure. "You have until the next new moon." The night before the new moon, Emeka did not sleep. He lay on his mat and listened to the compound breathe. His mother turned to sleep. His sister's soft cough. The distant sound of his uncle's generator. The one he had brought from the city and installed without asking, as though the compound had already changed ownership and no one had told the walls yet. Emeka stared at the ceiling and made calculations. His uncle had documents. The elders had given a deadline. Tabena's warning was 3 days old and the land registry office did not close on weekends. Every hour he waited was an hour the story was being written without him. In offices, in compounds, in the quiet conversations of men who had already decided how this would end. His father had said, "Wait for the ground." The ground had already cracked open 4 nights ago. He had been waiting for something more. A voice. A sign he could not misread. The kind of certainty that removes all doubt and all consequences at the same time. But certainty, he was beginning to understand, was not something the living ever fully received. At midnight he rose. He wrapped his father's old cloth around his shoulders, not for warmth, but because it was the closest thing to permission he could find. He took the lantern from beside the door. He took the short-handled hoe leaning against the outer wall, the one his father had used to plant yams the last season he was well enough to farm. He walked to the grave alone. The crack in the earth was still there, wider now than 4 nights ago, almost a full hand's width, running straight and clean across the mound like a seam waiting to be opened. The Ogilisai, the tree at the head of the grave, stood completely still despite the night breeze moving every other leaf in the compound. Emeka knelt. He pressed his palm flat against the earth, the way his father had pressed his thumb against his chest the night he gave the warning. He stayed like that for a long moment, feeling the temperature of the ground, feeling the strange dry warmth rising from the crack-like breath. Then he began to dig. Not frantically, not with the desperation of a man stealing. Slowly and deliberately, the way his father had taught him to do anything that mattered. When your hands are doing something important, let them know it. 3 inches. 6. A foot. The hoe struck something that was not soil. He set the hoe down and used his hands. Brushed the earth away carefully until the shape appeared. The Ujalisai leaf wrapping, dried and darkened but intact, the wax seal still unbroken, his father's thumbprint pressed into it like a signature from the other side. Emeka sat back on his heels. His hands were shaking. The thing that could not be undone had been done. He picked it up. The letter was not long. Emeka had expected pages. Had expected the weight of it to match its mystery. But when he finally broke the wax seal and unfolded the 3 layers of aged paper beneath the lantern light, what he found was his father's handwriting, steady, unhurried. The letters formed with the deliberate care of a man who wrote like he spoke, and it covered less than 2 full sides. He read it once. Then he sat very still for a long time. Then he read it again. By the time the first cock crowed, Emeka was no longer the same person who had knelt beside that grave with shaking hands. Something had shifted in him. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way transformation announces itself in stories. Quietly. The way a bone that has been set correctly stops hurting. He knew what to do. At dawn he went to his mother first. He sat beside her in the outer hut, the hut she had been moved to like a tenant in her own home, and he placed the letter in her hands and watched her face as she read. He watched the moment her eyes stopped moving. He watched her press the letter against her chest the exact same way he had pressed his palm against the grave. And he watched her cry, not the grief crying she had been doing for 6 months, but a different kind. The kind that comes when something lost is suddenly, impossibly returned. The letter contained a deed. Not for the compound alone. For the compound, the farmland behind it, the palm grove on the eastern hill, and the piece of land beside the market road that 3 men in Uguta had been quietly arguing over for 11 years, land that Ichinaji had purchased in his wife's name 12 years before he died, registered in a town office far enough away that no one in Uguta had thought to look there. His father had known. He had known his brother's character the way you know the character of weather, not by what it promises but by what it has always done. He had spent years quietly moving, quietly registering, quietly building a wall his family could not see but would one day need. The letter told Emeka exactly which office held the documents. Exactly which clerk had been paid to hold them safely. Exactly which elder in Uguta. One elder, the oldest, the one who had not been in the room when the deadline was given, was the only man whose witness signature would make everything final and uncontestable. Emeka went to that elder before the morning had fully opened. When his uncle arrived at the compound 2 hours later with his borrowed elders and his city documents and his warm smile, he found Emeka standing in the center of the compound, calm, straight-backed, holding a folder of papers that made every document in his uncle's hands worthless. Chukwuemeka read the deed once. He did not speak. He left before anyone offered him a seat. Emeka never spoke badly of his uncle. Not that day. Not in the weeks that followed. Not even when the compound was restored, when his mother returned to her kitchen without asking permission, when his sister lifted her eyes again and laughed the way she had laughed before grief taught her to be small. People expected anger from him. Expected a young man sharpened by injustice to cut everything within reach now that he finally had the blade. But Emeka had read his father's letter more times than he could count by then, and the last line of it had settled into him like a root finding water. His father had written, "The man who protects in silence builds walls that outlast the man who destroys with noise." That was all. No instruction to punish. No list of wrongs to correct. No permission to become the thing that had come against them. Just that one line, written in the same steady hand as everything else, as though it were the simplest truth in the world and always had been. Emeka understood, finally, what his father had been sharpening him for. Not for battle. For endurance. For the particular strength it takes to hold something precious quietly, in the dark, under pressure, without letting anyone see you sweat, and then to open your hand at exactly the right moment and let the light do what the noise never could. Ichinaji had not buried that letter to win a fight. He had buried it to end one, cleanly, completely, without leaving wounds in the family that would need another generation to heal. That was the inheritance. Not the land. Not the deed. Not the palm grove or the market road plot or any of the things that could be measured and divided and argued over. The inheritance was the method. And Emeka had received it. There is a saying that did not exist before Ichinaji planted it in that ground and let his son dig it up. What is buried with patience does not rot, it becomes a root. The men who come loudly will take what they can carry, but the man who plants in silence grows what no one can lift. If your family has ever faced someone who tried to take what was not theirs, someone who used tradition, or titles, or borrowed authority to reach into what your people built, then you already know what Emeka felt standing in that compound with those papers in his hand. If you were Emeka, and you had found that letter at midnight, would you have waited for the elders to act, or would you have done exactly what he did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right time, subscribe and hit the bell. The next story is already waiting for you.